Hello there. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time, not to the Athens we all know from the history books, with its gleaming marble and its thunderous political debates, but to an older, softer, more mysterious city. We're going to wander through the hidden layers of ancient Athens, in the years and centuries before the idea of democracy was ever born. It's a place of shadows and whispers, of powerful families and whispered prayers to the gods on a high rocky hill. I'm so glad you could join me on this quiet journey. If you feel so inclined, and if this space brings you a little bit of peace, perhaps take just a soft moment to like this video and to subscribe so we can travel together again. And in that same gentle spirit, I always love to know who I'm sharing this story with. If you'd like, you could leave a quiet comment, telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? All of us, scattered across the globe, sharing in the same quiet moment of peace. But for now, let's let the modern world fade away. Let's imagine the scent of olive groves on a warm breeze, the distant sound of a hammer on bronze, the flicker of an oil lamp in a simple home. Who were the people who walked these paths, who built this city upon foundations of myth and might, long before the world knew the name of democracy? What forgotten stories are held in the ancient stones, waiting for us to listen? The air in this early Athens feels different, doesn't it? It's thick with the dust of unpaved roads and the salty tang of the nearby sea, but it's also heavy with something else, a sense of order, of power held not by many, but by a very select few. Before the sunlight of open debate ever touched the city's public squares, Athens was shaped in the cool, quiet shadows of private courtyards and exclusive meeting halls. The city's first true architects weren't builders of stone, but builders of influence, the powerful oligarchs, whose names are now mostly lost to time, like words written in sand. These were the men who held the reins of the city, not through a vote, but through the undeniable weight of their birthright, their land, and their wealth. Imagine a city not as a bustling hub of citizens, but as a vast estate, owned and operated by a handful of prominent families. Each family was like a deep-rooted ancient olive tree, its branches spreading wide across the Attic plain, its roots sunk deep into the most fertile soil. Their wealth wasn't just in coins of silver, which were still a relatively new concept, but in the land itself. They owned the vast fields of wheat and barley, the silver mines in the distant hills, and the groves that produced the lifeblood of the Greek world, olive oil. This connection to the land gave them a legitimacy that was almost divine in the eyes of the common people. These powerful families, known as the Eupatridae, or the well-fathered, saw themselves as the rightful guardians of Athens. They believed they were descended from the city's founding heroes, or perhaps even the gods themselves, and this belief was the bedrock of their authority. Their governance wasn't a system of written laws and public offices, as we might think of it today. It was a more personal, intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and obligations. Marriages between their sons and daughters were not affairs of the heart, but strategic mergers, designed to consolidate land and power, weaving their family fortunes together into an unbreakable tapestry of control. Their days were not spent in open forums. Instead, picture them gathering in the andron, the men's quarters of a sprawling private home, the air thick with the scent of wine and roasting meat. Here, reclining on cushioned couches, they would decide the fate of the city. They would appoint the magistrates, the officials who ran the city's affairs, from among their own ranks. They would determine when Athens would go to war and who would lead its armies. Their decisions were made not for the good of a nameless, faceless public, but for the preservation and enhancement of their own family lines and their collective power. It was a deeply personal and often ruthless form of politics, a quiet game of chess played with land, loyalty, and lives. For the ordinary Athenian, these oligarchs were distant, almost mythical figures. A small farmer, working a stony plot of land on the slopes of Mount Hymettus, would likely never speak to one of these men. He would only feel their presence through the demands of the tax collector, or the decree that a portion of his harvest was owed to the great family whose land he worked. The power of the Eupatridae was an accepted fact of life, as immutable as the cycle of the seasons. It was a system built on dependence, where the many relied on the few for protection, for loans in times of drought, and for the resolution of disputes. But this dependence came at a steep price, their own freedom and a share in their city's destiny. This was the world that existed in the quiet twilight, before the dawn of democracy. It was a city of silent hierarchies and unspoken rules, governed by men who believed that power was their birthright. They were the shadowy architects, and the Athens they built was strong, ordered, and stable. But it was also a city holding its breath, a place where the vast majority of people had no voice, no say in the great matters that shaped their lives. The foundations they laid were solid, built of wealth and tradition, but deep within that foundation, tiny, almost invisible cracks were beginning to form, as new ideas and new pressures began to slowly, inexorably, press in from the outside world. As we continue our walk through this quiet, pre-democratic Athens, you can feel how the sacred is woven into the very fabric of the everyday. The whispers of the gods are not confined to grand temples on high. They drift through the olive groves, rustle in the fields of wheat, and echo in the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Religion in this early city wasn't a separate part of life, something you attended to once a week. It was the operating system of society, the invisible framework that gave meaning to everything from the planting of a seed to the ruling of the city. It was the source of law, the justification for power, and the shared language of every Athenian, from the mightiest oligarch to the humblest potter. At the heart of this sacred landscape, rising above the scattered houses and fields, was the Acropolis. But this is not the Acropolis of Pericles, crowned with the gleaming Parthenon. In these earlier, quieter times, the high city was a more rugged, ancient place, a true fortress sanctuary. It was the home of Athena, the city's fierce and wise protector goddess. To the early Athenians, she was not just a distant deity to be worshipped, but a living presence, a divine guardian, whose favor was essential for the city's survival. The most important rituals, which bound the community together, took place here, on this sacred rock. Imagine a procession slowly winding its way up the steep path to the Acropolis. It's led by the city's chief magistrates, who are not just political leaders, but also high priests. These men, drawn from the great oligarchic families, held their power because they were seen as the intermediaries between the mortal city and the divine realm. Their authority to rule was inseparable from their duty to perform the correct rituals, to read the omens in the flight of birds or the entrails of a sacrificed animal, and to ensure the gods remained pleased with Athens. Their political power was sanctified, wrapped in the awesome mystery of religious tradition. This fusion of the political and the priestly was absolute. The religious calendar dictated the rhythm of life. Festivals were not just holidays, they were vital civic duties. There was the Panathenaea, a grand festival in honor of Athena, where the community came together to reaffirm their collective identity under her protection. There were smaller, more agricultural festivals, like the Thesmophoria, a women-only ritual dedicated to the earth goddess Demeter, meant to ensure the fertility of the fields. These rituals were the threads that stitched society together. They reminded everyone of their place in the cosmic order, an order where the gods were at the top, the priest aristocrats just below them, and the common people forming the broad base, all working together to maintain the Pax Diorum, the peace of the gods. This divine framework also shaped the earliest forms of law. Before laws were written down on stone tablets for all to see, they existed as sacred traditions, believed to have been handed down from the gods themselves. A dispute between neighbors over a property line wasn't just a legal matter, it was a potential disruption of the divine order. Justice was administered by the oligarchs, not just as judges, but as interpreters of this sacred law. They would preside over trials in sacred spaces, often near an altar or a holy shrine, and their verdicts were seen as reflecting the will of the gods. For an ordinary person, to defy a magistrate's ruling was not just to break a rule, but to commit an act of impiety, a dangerous offense against the divine powers that watched over the city. Even the structure of the family was a religious institution. The head of each household, the paterfamilias, acted as the priest for his own family, maintaining the household shrine and honoring the spirits of his ancestors. The family was a sacred unit, and the great aristocratic clans were simply the largest and most powerful of these sacred units. Their claim to rule was reinforced by their elaborate family tombs and their meticulously maintained genealogies, which often traced their lineage back to a mythical hero or a minor god. In this world, power didn't come from a mandate of the people, it flowed downward from the heavens, channeled through the bloodlines of the chosen few. This deeply ingrained religious worldview created a society that was profoundly conservative, resistant to change, and accepting of its rigid hierarchy. It was a world where tradition was truth, and the will of the gods was the ultimate law. There comes a point in the life of any growing society when unspoken traditions are no longer enough. As Athens grew, as its trade routes lengthened and its population swelled, the old ways of justice, administered from the private homes of the Eupatridae, began to feel strained. The quiet web of personal obligations and divine whispers started to fray under the pressure of new complexities. It was in this murky, transitional period that a new kind of figure emerged from the shadows of Athenian history, the lawgiver. These men were tasked with a monumental, almost impossible job to take the unwritten, often contradictory customs of the past and carve them into something solid, something permanent, something that could be seen and read by all. The names of these early lawgivers, like Draco and later Solon, have come down to us shrouded in mystery and legend. They were not kings or tyrants in the traditional sense. They were often aristocrats themselves, but they were granted extraordinary temporary authority by their peers to act as mediators and reformers in a time of growing crisis. The very idea of writing down the law was revolutionary. It represented a subtle but profound shift in power. A law that is written down can be debated, it can be pointed to. It exists independently of the magistrate who is interpreting it, creating a new impartial authority in the city. Let's first think about Draco, whose name has become synonymous with harshness. We imagine his laws as being written in blood, and in many ways they were. He is said to have codified the laws around homicide, establishing a formal court to hear such cases. Before him, a killing was often a private matter for the victim's family to resolve, usually through a violent cycle of blood feuds that could tear the fabric of society apart for generations. Draco's code, as severe as it was, replaced this chaotic personal vengeance with a public civic process. It was the city, not the family, that would now dispense justice. This was a massive step, the beginning of a legal system that belonged to the community as a whole. But Draco's laws also reinforced the existing power structures in many ways. His punishments for lesser crimes, like the theft of a cabbage, were notoriously severe, often death. This reflected the aristocracy's deep-seated fear of social disorder and their desire to protect property above all else. For the small farmer, already struggling under a mountain of debt, these written laws may have felt less like a protection and more like a cage, a formal system that codified their powerlessness. Yet, the simple act of inscription was a crack of light in a closed room. For the first time, the rules were, at least in theory, the same for everyone who could read them or have them read to them. Then, a generation or so later, came Solon. By his time, the social tensions in Athens had reached a breaking point. Many small farmers had fallen into a desperate state of debt bondage, effectively becoming serfs on their own land, owing their labor and their future to the wealthy aristocrats who held their loans. The threat of a violent city-wide revolution was very real. Solon was appointed as a mediator, an archon with special powers to reform the state. His work was far more sweeping than Draco's. It was a delicate, masterful act of social and political re-engineering, an attempt to rebalance the city before it tore itself apart. Solon's most famous reform was the seisachtheia, the shaking off of burdens. With this single radical act, he cancelled all outstanding debts and forbade the practice of securing loans on the person of the borrower. He freed those who had been enslaved for debt and brought back those who had been sold abroad. Imagine the incredible earth-shattering relief that must have swept through the Attic countryside. It was a reset, a moment of profound liberation that prevented a bloody civil war. But Solon was a careful tightrope walker. He didn't confiscate the land of the rich and redistribute it. as the poorest demanded. He sought a middle path, aiming to restore harmony rather than enact a total revolution. He understood that the city needed its wealthy families, but it could not survive if its poorest citizens were pushed into utter desperation. This balancing act, this search for a just equilibrium, was a foundational principle that would echo through the later development of democratic thought. To truly understand this pre-democratic world, we need to step inside the lives of the gilded few, the aristocracy that held Athens in its genteel but iron grip. Theirs was a world apart, a realm of privilege and responsibility, of intricate social codes and profound self-assurance. For the Eupatridae, their position at the top of society was not merely a matter of wealth. It was a reflection of their inherent excellence, their atia, a concept that blended virtue, nobility, and a warrior's prowess. They believed they were, quite simply, better born, better educated, and better equipped by nature and the gods to lead. This belief was the psychological bedrock of their class and the source of their unquestioned authority for centuries. Their lives were centered around the oikos, the household, which was far more than just a family home. It was a sprawling economic and social unit, encompassing the main family, their extended relatives, their servants, their slaves, and their agricultural estates. The master of the oikos wielded immense power within this domain, but he also bore immense responsibility. He had to manage the land, oversee the harvest, negotiate trade, and maintain the family's religious rites. The success of his oikos was the measure of his worth as a man. These households were the building blocks of the aristocratic state, each one a small kingdom unto itself, bound to others through a complex network of alliance and rivalry. The education of an aristocratic son was designed to cultivate areta. From a young age, he would be trained in the arts of war and governance. He learned to ride a horse, to throw a javelin, and to command men in the disciplined ranks of the phalanx. But his education was not purely martial. He would also sit at the feet of poets, learning to recite the epic tales of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These were not just stories to him, they were his history, the chronicles of his heroic ancestors. In the deeds of Achilles and Odysseus, he saw the ideals he was meant to embody: courage, honor, and a fierce competitive drive to be the best. This competitive spirit was a defining feature of aristocratic culture. It played out in athletic contests at religious festivals, where young nobles vied for glory in running, wrestling, and chariot racing. A victory wreath was more valuable than gold, a symbol of personal and familial honor. It also played out in the political sphere, where the great families constantly maneuvered for the most prestigious offices and the most influence. This was a world of intense personal rivalries, where a slight to one's honor could lead to a lasting feud. Yet, there was also a powerful code of conduct that governed their interactions, a sense of shared identity that bound them together as a class, separate from and superior to the common people. Their social life revolved around the symposium, a ritualized drinking party that was far more than simple entertainment. After the evening meal, the men would gather in the andron, reclining on couches arranged around the room. Wine, mixed with water in a central crater, was served, and the evening would unfold with conversation, poetry, music, and games. The symposium was a place where political alliances were forged, business deals were discussed, and the cultural values of the aristocracy were reinforced. It was an exclusive space, a closed circle where the future of the city was debated and decided, far from the ears of the common folk. For a young aristocrat, to be included in these gatherings was a crucial rite of passage, his entry into the inner circle of power. The world of the common Athenian, the farmer, the potter, the blacksmith, was a world they might command, but one they never truly inhabited. The story of early Athens is also a story written in spear points and stone walls. The way a society fights, the way it defends its homes and its fields, reveals so much about its values, its structure, and its deepest fears. In the centuries leading up to democracy, Athens' military strategies underwent a slow but profound transformation, a shift that mirrored and in many ways drove the changes happening within the city itself. The evolution from a warrior ethos, centered on the individual aristocratic hero, to a disciplined core of citizen soldiers, laid the military groundwork for the political revolution to come. It's a quiet but essential part of our story. In the earliest days, the age reflected in the Homeric epics. Warfare was a chaotic and aristocratic affair. The model was the duel of champions, great heroes like Achilles, clad in gleaming bronze armor, riding chariots to the front lines, to challenge their counterparts to single combat. The battle was a collection of individual contests, a chance for the noble warrior to win personal glory, or kleos. The common soldiers were largely an afterthought, a poorly armed mob who followed their lord into battle, but played a secondary role to the main, heroic action. This form of warfare perfectly reflected the society that practiced it, a world dominated by a few great men, whose personal prowess determined the fate of the many. But as the Greek city-states, the polis, began to mature, this style of fighting became increasingly obsolete. A new, revolutionary, military formation began to take hold across Greece, the phalanx. This was a dense block of infantry soldiers, called hoplites, packed, shoulder to shoulder, in tight ranks, typically 8 deep. Each hoplite was armed with a long, heavy spear, a short sword, and a large, round shield, called a hoplon. The shield was the key innovation. It was designed to be held on the left arm, and it was large enough to protect not only its bearer, but also the man standing to his left. This simple fact changed everything. The phalanx was not a formation of individual heroes. Its strength lay in its collective unity and discipline. A single hoplite was vulnerable, but a phalanx, with its bristling wall of spears and its interlocking wall of shields, was a formidable, almost unstoppable force on the battlefield. Success depended not on individual acts of daring, but on each man holding his position, trusting the man next to him, and moving as one. It was a powerful physical manifestation of a new idea, the strength of the collective over the glory of the individual. This was a radical departure from the old aristocratic ideal, and it had profound social consequences. Who were these hoplites? They were not the super-wealthy aristocrats, who could still afford horses and fancy armor, nor were they the poorest laborers, who could not afford any armor at all. The hoplites were the middling citizens, the men who owned enough land to afford their own shield, helmet, breastplate, and spear. They were the sturdy, independent farmers, the backbone of the Athenian economy. For the first time, these men became the decisive factor in the city's defense. They were the ones who stood in the line, who pushed back the invaders, who bled for the survival of the polis. This new military reality began to slowly alter the political calculus in Athens. A man who was expected to risk his life for the city, who was an essential part of its military machine, began to feel that he deserved a voice in its governance. If his courage and discipline were what kept the city safe, why should he have no say in the decisions that might lead to war? The shared experience of the phalanx, the training, the terror of battle, the trust forged between neighbors in the shield wall, created a new sense of solidarity and civic identity among this growing class of citizen soldiers. They were no longer just subjects of the Eupatridae, they were partners in the city's defense. This quiet, creeping sense of entitlement, this dawning awareness of their own collective importance, was one of the most powerful currents pushing Athens towards a more inclusive political system. The spear and the stone of the phalanx were, in their own silent way, chipping away at the foundations of aristocratic rule. Let's return for a moment to that high, rocky outcrop at the center of the city. The Acropolis was always the soul of Athens, but its role in the city's political life in these early centuries was something quite different from what it would later become. It wasn't a symbol of democratic glory, but a potent instrument of aristocratic power. It was the physical embodiment of the deep bond between the ruling class, the gods, and the very land of Attica itself. The political rituals that took place on its sacred ground were designed to reinforce the existing order, to publicly display the Eupatridae's unique connection to the divine, and to legitimize their right to rule in the eyes of the people gathered below. In these archaic times, the Acropolis was not just a sanctuary, it was also the city's final fortress. Its formidable defensive walls, some of which dated back to the even more ancient Mycenaean era, made it a place of refuge in times of war. This dual function as both fortress and holy place was crucial. It meant that the city's physical security and its spiritual well-being were fused together in this one location, and the aristocrats who controlled the Acropolis controlled the very heart of Athens. Access to its most sacred precincts was a jealously guarded privilege, a visible sign of one's standing in the city's rigid hierarchy. The most important political offices in early Athens were the archonships. The archons were the chief magistrates, and their inauguration was a key political ritual that took place on the Acropolis. Imagine an archon-elect, a man from one of the great families, ascending the slope to take his oath of office. He would do so in full view of the city, his procession a public performance of power. The oath itself would be sworn at a sacred altar, in the presence of the gods. He would pledge not only to uphold the laws of the city, but also to protect its religious traditions. This ceremony was a powerful piece of political theatre, a declaration that this man's authority came not from the people, but from a sacred trust bestowed upon him by the gods, witnessed and approved by the priestly class. Furthermore, the Acropolis was the city's treasury. The wealth of the state, such as it was stored within the precinct of the main temple, under the watchful eye of the goddess Athena. This meant that the men who controlled the city's religion also controlled its finances. The line between temple offerings and state funds was blurry at best. This gave the aristocratic priests and archons enormous practical power, allowing them to fund public works, pay for military expeditions, and dispense patronage, all under the guise of managing the goddess's property. The control of the sacred rock was, in a very real sense, the control of the economic lifeblood of Athens. One of the most significant early buildings on the Acropolis was the precursor to the Parthenon, a temple often called the Hecatompedon, or the 100-footer. This was the house of the goddess, and it was here that the most exclusive rituals took place. It was also a repository of the city's collective memory and identity. Within its walls, or nearby, were sacred relics that linked the Athenians to their mythical past: an olive tree believed to have been a gift from Athena herself, a saltwater spring said to have been struck by Poseidon's trident. These were not just quaint stories, they were charters of legitimacy. The oligarchic families who served as the priests and guardians of these holy sites were by extension the guardians of Athenian identity itself. To challenge their rule was to challenge the very myths that held the city together. The rituals they performed on the Acropolis were a constant, visible reaffirmation of this fact, a silent sermon in stone and smoke that preached the gospel of aristocratic privilege. While the great families drew their primary strength from the land, other, quieter forces were at work, slowly reshaping the city's destiny. Unseen rivers of commerce began to flow into Athens, carrying with them not just goods, but new ideas, new wealth, and a new kind of power that wasn't tied to ancestral estates. The rise of trade and commerce in the centuries before democracy was a subtle but relentless current, eroding the old certainties of the land-based aristocracy and creating new opportunities for men whose fortunes were made, not from the soil, but from the sea. This was a gradual but momentous shift, the dawn of a new economic reality that would have profound political consequences. Early Athens was not, initially, a great maritime power. Its strength was agricultural, but its location was strategic. With its 3 natural harbours in the Bay of Phaleron, it was well positioned to become a hub for the burgeoning trade networks of the Aegean world. Athenian ships, initially small and cautious, began to venture further from shore. They carried the surplus of the Attic plain, fine olive oil, stored in beautifully decorated vases, and high-quality honey and wine, to other city-states and islands. In return, they brought back things that Attica lacked: timber for shipbuilding from the north, precious metals from the east, and most importantly, grain from the fertile lands around the Black Sea. This growing trade created a new class of people. These were the merchants, the ship owners, and the skilled craftsmen who made the goods for export. Unlike the old eupatridae, their wealth was not static and tied to the land. It was liquid, dynamic, and potentially limitless. A successful merchant could, in a few profitable voyages, accumulate a fortune that rivaled that of an old landed aristocrat. These newly wealthy men might not have the ancient family names or the heroic genealogies, but they had silver, and in a growing city, silver could buy influence. They could afford to equip themselves as hoplites, contributing to the city's defense. They could lend money, becoming patrons to those in need. They began to form their own circles of influence, their own networks of power that existed outside the traditional aristocratic structures. The craftsmen, too, saw their status rise. Athenian pottery, in particular, became a highly sought-after commodity throughout the Mediterranean. In the bustling potters' quarter, the kerameikos, master artisans, and their apprentices, produced stunning black figure and later red figure vases, their surfaces covered with intricate scenes from mythology and daily life. These were not just humble craftsmen, they were artists and entrepreneurs. A master potter, with a successful workshop, was a respected figure, a man of substance. He employed workers, engaged in commerce, and was an active participant in the city's economic life. He was part of a growing urban population, whose concerns and ambitions were very different from those of both the landed nobility and the rural peasantry. This new commercial wealth began to challenge the old order in subtle ways. The aristocracy, whose power was based on the inherited ownership of land, suddenly found themselves competing with men whose success was based on skill, risk-taking, and commercial acumen. They could no longer be the only wealthy and influential people in the city. This created tension. The old families often looked down on the new money of the traders and craftsmen, viewing commerce as a less noble pursuit than agriculture. But they could not ignore their growing power. The city needed the grain the merchants imported, the ships they built, and the taxes they paid. This economic diversification was a crucial prerequisite for the development of democracy. It broke the monopoly of power held by the landed elite and created alternative pathways to influence and status. It fostered a more complex, dynamic society with a variety of competing interests. The concerns of a ship owner worried about piracy were very different from the concerns of an oligarch worried about his olive harvest. As these new groups grew in confidence and number, they naturally began to demand a political voice commensurate with their economic importance. The unseen rivers of coin were slowly but surely carving out new channels of power, channels that would eventually flow into the open agora of a democratic Athens. No city is an island, and the Athens of this early era was no exception. Its identity was forged, not just by its internal struggles and developments, but also by its complex and ever-shifting relationships with the constellation of other city-states that dotted the Greek world. To its neighbors, Athens was just one polis among many, sometimes a rival, sometimes an ally, often a competitor for land, resources, and prestige. This constant interaction with the outside world, this dance of diplomacy, trade, and warfare, was a powerful catalyst for change within Athens itself, forcing it to define who it was and what it stood for in a crowded and often hostile neighborhood. The landscape of archaic Greece was a patchwork of fierce loyalties and intense localism. A man from Corinth or Thebes or Megara felt a profound allegiance to his own city, his own laws, and his own gods. These city-states were rivals in every sense of the word. They competed in athletics at the great Pan-Hellenic Games, like those at Olympia and Delphi. They competed economically, vying for control of lucrative trade routes. And most frequently, they competed militarily, engaging in near-constant small-scale border wars over disputed patches of farmland or access to a strategic mountain pass. For Athens, one of its earliest and most persistent rivals was the nearby island of Aegina, a major maritime power. Aegina's merchants and sailors were Athens' direct competitors in the Aegean sea lanes. This rivalry was bitter and long-lasting, a constant thorn in Athens' side that spurred the development of its own naval capabilities. Another troublesome neighbor was the city of Megara, to the west. Athens and Megara fought for generations over control of the island of Salamis, which sat strategically in the Saronic Gulf between them. These conflicts, though often small in scale, had a significant impact back home. They required the mobilization of hoplite armies, reinforcing the military importance of the middling farmers. They also required strong leadership, which sometimes created opportunities for ambitious aristocrats to rise to prominence as successful generals, a path to power that could sometimes lead to a tyranny. But relationships weren't always hostile. Alliances were formed, often out of shared fear of a greater threat. And beyond formal politics, there was a shared sense of Greek identity that transcended local rivalries. All Greeks, or Hellenes, as they called themselves, worshipped the same pantheon of Olympian gods. They spoke dialects of the same language. They shared a common cultural heritage in the Homeric epics. This sense of a shared culture was nurtured at pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Delphi, where the famous oracle of Apollo would offer cryptic advice to cities and individuals from all over the Greek world. An Athenian aristocrat, visiting Delphi, would rub shoulders with his counterparts from Sparta or Corinth, participating in a shared religious and cultural experience that reminded them of what they had in common. And then there was Sparta. Even in these early days, the relationship with Sparta was different. Located in the isolated valley of Laconia, on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, Sparta was a unique and formidable power. It was a militaristic, inward-looking society, starkly different from the increasingly commercial and outward-looking Athens. While not yet the great superpower rivalry it would later become, the two cities were already on divergent paths, and they watched each other with a mixture of suspicion and respect. Sparta, with its invincible hoplite army, was the dominant land power in Greece. Athens, in turn, was beginning to look towards the sea. This early dynamic, the contrast between the Spartan spear and the Athenian oar, would come to define much of later Greek history. The presence of this powerful, strangely organized neighbor to the south was a constant factor in Athens' strategic thinking, a shadow that influenced its alliances and its own military development. This constant need to navigate a complex world of rivals and allies forced Athens to become more organized, more resilient, and more aware of its own collective identity, planting seeds of civic consciousness that were essential for its later political evolution. Long before the word democracy was ever spoken, before citizens gathered to cast their votes on shards of pottery, the seeds of popular assembly were already dormant in the Athenian soil. The idea that the community should have some role, however limited, in affirming the decisions of its leaders was not a sudden invention. It had deep roots in the ancient past, in the traditions of the tribe and the army. This early assembly, the ecclesia, was a pale shadow of the powerful institution it would one day become, but its mere existence was a quiet acknowledgement of a fundamental principle, that the people, the demos, could not be entirely ignored. It was a forum where the voice of the common man, though faint, could occasionally be heard. The origins of the assembly are likely military. Imagine an army of hoplites gathered in a field before a battle. The general, an aristocrat, would need to address his troops, to explain the plan, to bolster their morale. He would speak, and they would listen. At the end of his speech, they might signal their approval by banging their spears on their shields, a thunderous, visceral expression of collective will. This was not a debate or a vote in our sense. It was a ritual of acclamation. But it established a crucial precedent. The leaders spoke, and the mass of fighting men affirmed. The act of gathering, of listening, and of responding, as a group created a sense of shared purpose and identity. In the city, this tradition carried over into a civic assembly. In the time of Solon, and likely before, all adult male citizens had the right to attend the ecclesia. They would gather on a hill called the Pnyx, a natural, amphitheatre-like space that looked out over the city. But the power of this early assembly was severely limited. It did not have the right to initiate legislation. It couldn't propose laws or debate policy freely. Its role was largely passive. The aristocratic magistrates and a council of elders, the Areopagus, would make the decisions in private. Then they would present these decisions to the assembled citizens for ratification. Picture the scene. A powerful archon, a member of a great Eupatrid family, stands before the crowd. He announces a new decree, perhaps a decision to go to war with Megara. The assembled farmers and craftsmen would listen. They might murmur amongst themselves, but there was no formal mechanism for organized opposition or debate. Their role was to approve what had already been decided by their social superiors. The vote, when it was taken, might have been a simple show of hands or a shout of aye or nay. It was easy for the powerful men on the stage to intimidate the crowd and ensure the outcome they desired. So why did the aristocracy bother with this charade at all? Because it served a vital purpose for them as well. The assembly was a tool for building consensus and demonstrating popular support, even if that support was largely manufactured. A decision that was acclaimed by the ecclesia, even nominally, carried more weight and legitimacy than one simply issued by decree. It gave the policies of the oligarchs the veneer of popular consent. It also served as a useful social safety valve, a place where the common people could feel that they were, in some small way, participating in the life of the city. It allowed them to see their leaders, to hear their voices, and to feel a part of the collective body of Athens. Yet, despite its weakness, the simple existence of the ecclesia held a revolutionary potential. It was a physical manifestation of the demos. It was a space where all citizens, regardless of their wealth or birth, could gather together as equals, at least in theory. It established the principle that the ultimate authority of the state rested, in some foundational way, with the entire citizen body. The oligarchs may have controlled the agenda and dominated the proceedings, but they could not abolish the assembly itself. It was a sleeping giant, for now it was a passive audience, a rubber stamp, but the seeds were planted. The idea that the people had a right to gather, to listen, and to assent was now a part of the Athenian political landscape. It would only be a matter of time before they began to demand the right not just to approve, but to speak, to argue, and to decide for themselves. In the midst of all this political and social change, another quieter revolution was beginning. A revolution of the mind, in the bustling port cities of Ionia, across the Aegean Sea, and slowly trickling back into mainland Greece. A new way of looking at the world was being born. This was the dawn of philosophy, the first stirrings of a radical idea that the universe was not simply the whimsical playground of the gods, but a rational, ordered place, a cosmos whose secrets could be understood through observation and reason. This intellectual awakening, though it started far from Athens, would eventually find its most fertile ground there, and it would provide the intellectual tools necessary for the invention of democracy. The first of these thinkers, men like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, are what we now call the pre-Socratics. They were fascinated by the natural world. They looked at the sky, the sea, and the earth, and they asked a new kind of question. Instead of asking which god controls the weather, they asked, what is the world made of? Thales famously proposed that everything was, in some fundamental way, made of water. Anaximander suggested an indefinite, boundless substance he called the apeiron. What was revolutionary was not the answers they came up with, but the very nature of their inquiry. They were searching for natural, universal principles, not supernatural explanations. This new habit of mind, the search for underlying principles, the use of logic and evidence, the willingness to question traditional beliefs, was profoundly radical. It implicitly challenged the old world of myth and divine authority. If the weather could be explained by the movement of air and moisture, then the power of Zeus, the sky god, was diminished. If the social order was a human creation, not a divine one, then it could be criticized, analyzed, and perhaps even changed for the better. Philosophy and critical thinking were like a solvent, slowly beginning to dissolve the ancient certainties that held the aristocratic world together. This intellectual ferment found a receptive audience in a city like Athens. Its growing trade connections brought it into contact with these new Ionian ideas. Its increasingly complex society, with its competing interest groups, created a need for more sophisticated ways of thinking about justice, law, and community. The work of the lawgivers, like Solon, was itself a kind of early political philosophy. Solon wasn't just issuing decrees, he was trying to create a balanced, harmonious system based on principles of fairness and order, or eunomia. He was applying reason to the problems of society, attempting to engineer a better state, much like Thales was trying to understand the fundamental engineering of the cosmos. Moreover, the rise of literacy, though still limited, played a crucial role. As laws were written down, they became objects of study and interpretation. The ability to read and to construct a logical argument became a valuable political skill. In the law courts and in political debates, success began to depend not just on your family name, but on your ability to persuade others through reasoned speech. This placed a new emphasis on education and on the arts of rhetoric and logic. A new kind of man was emerging, the citizen who could think critically and speak persuasively. This is not to say that philosophy immediately swept away the old religious beliefs. For the vast majority of Athenians, the gods remained very real and very powerful. But among the educated elite, and slowly trickling down to the broader population, a new skepticism and a new confidence in human reason were taking root. This dawning of reason was a crucial precondition for democracy. Democracy is, at its heart, a profound statement of faith in the ability of ordinary people to use reason to govern themselves. It requires citizens to listen to arguments, to weigh evidence, and to make rational decisions about the common good. The first stirrings of philosophy, with their radical insistence on logic and critical inquiry, were what first made such a revolutionary idea even conceivable. They were sharpening the tools that the Athenians would soon use to build a whole new world. To truly grasp the tensions that were building in this archaic city, we need to look beyond the grand narratives of oligarchs and hoplites and see the complex, often unspoken divisions that ran through Athenian society. It was not a simple pyramid with the Eupatridae at the top and everyone else at the bottom. It was a more intricate tapestry of classes and groups, each with its own interests, anxieties, and ambitions. The friction between these groups, the constant push and pull of their competing needs, was the engine of change, driving Athens towards the great reforms of Solon and beyond. The stage for democracy was set not just by great men, but by the anonymous struggles of thousands. At the very top, as we've seen, were the Eupatridae, the landed aristocracy. Their power was old, rooted in their vast ancestral estates. Below them, but increasingly challenging them, was the growing class of merchants, ship owners, and master craftsmen. These men, sometimes as wealthy as the aristocrats, represented a new kind of power based on mobile, commercial wealth. They were often excluded from the highest political offices, which were reserved for the old families, and this bred a deep resentment. They felt their economic contribution to the city was not matched by their political influence, and they were hungry for a greater share of power. Below these two elite groups was the broad middle class of the hoplite farmers. These were the Zeugitai, men who owned their own small or medium-sized farms, the yokemen who could afford a team of oxen. They were the backbone of the army and the economy. They were fiercely independent, proud of their self-sufficiency, but their position was often precarious. A single bad harvest, a drought, or a family illness could force them to borrow money from their wealthy aristocratic neighbors. These loans were the source of the great social crisis that Solon had to address. As more and more of these yeoman farmers lost their land or fell into debt bondage, the very stability of the state was threatened. Their great desire was for security, to be protected from debt slavery, and to have their land ownership guaranteed. Further down the social ladder were the Thetes. These were the poorest of the citizens, men who owned no land and worked as hired laborers on the farms of others, or as rowers in the growing Athenian fleet. They were free men and citizens, unlike slaves, but they lived a marginal existence. They could not afford the armor to serve as hoplites, so their role in the military was limited. In the early days, their political power was virtually non-existent. They could attend the assembly, but their voices carried little weight. They were often overlooked, the silent majority of the city, but their sheer numbers represented a vast untapped source of potential power, a fact that later democratic reformers would recognize and harness. Finally, at the very bottom of the social structure, were the slaves. They were not citizens, they were property. They were captured in war or bought in foreign markets. They worked in the silver mines, on the large agricultural estates of the aristocrats, and in the homes of any family that could afford them. We know very little about their lives, as their voices are almost completely absent from the historical record. But their labor was essential to the Athenian economy. The existence of a large slave class freed up many citizens, even those of modest means, from the most grueling manual labor, giving them the leisure, the schol, to participate in military training, and later, in the time-consuming business of democratic politics. The Athenian experiment with freedom was paradoxically built upon a foundation of slavery. These unspoken divides, these layers of status and wealth, created a society that was dynamic, unstable, and ripe for change. It was a city pulling in multiple directions at once, a complex system of social pressures that was building towards a monumental release. The story of a society's journey towards fairness can often be read in the evolution of its courts and its concept of justice. In early Athens, the path from the private judgment of an aristocrat to a public trial by one's peers was a long and winding one, but it was absolutely fundamental to the rise of democracy. The gradual creation of a formal, accessible, and impartial judicial system was one of the most important ways in which the power of the few was slowly transferred to the many. When an ordinary citizen can stand in a court and expect to be judged by the law, and not by the whim of a powerful man, something profound has changed in the soul of a city. In the very earliest times, justice, as we have seen, was a private affair. It was dispensed by the head of the oikos, the local lord, or through the violent mechanism of the blood feud. The first great step away from this was the codification of law by figures like Draco. But writing down the law is one thing. Ensuring it is applied fairly is another entirely. The primary court of early Athens was a council called the Areopagus. This was a council of elders, composed entirely of former archons. Since the archons themselves were always drawn from the most powerful eupatrid families, the Areopagus was the ultimate bastion of aristocratic power. Imagine a small farmer bringing a case before this council. He would stand before a group of stern, wealthy old men who were the social and economic superiors of everyone he knew. They were the very people he might be in debt to. The proceedings would be intimidating. The ancient, unwritten traditions they cited opaque. There was little hope for a common man to receive an impartial hearing in such a setting. The Areopagus was a council of a single class, judging society according to its own interests and its own values. It was a powerful instrument for maintaining the status quo. The reforms of Solon were a direct challenge to this aristocratic monopoly on justice. Solon understood that for his other reforms to have any meaning, ordinary citizens needed a way to defend their new rights. So, he created a new court of appeal, the Helia. This court was open to all citizens, who could be chosen by lot to serve as jurors. This was a revolutionary idea. It meant that a magistrate's decision could be challenged and potentially overturned by a jury of ordinary Athenians. For the first time, the common people were given a direct role in the administration of justice. Serving on a jury in the Helia was a powerful education in civic life. A farmer or a craftsman would have to listen to complex arguments from both sides of a case. He would have to deliberate with his fellow jurors and come to a collective decision based on the law and the evidence presented. This process trained citizens to think critically, to speak publicly, and to take responsibility for the well-being of their community. The law was no longer a mysterious weapon wielded by the elite. It was becoming a common possession, a tool that any citizen could use to seek redress. Solon also introduced another crucial legal innovation, the right of any citizen to bring a prosecution on behalf of a third party who had been wronged. Before this, only the victim or their family could initiate a case. This meant that a poor, powerless man who was abused by a wealthy noble often had no realistic way to seek justice. Now, another citizen, perhaps a more prominent one, could take up his cause and bring the case to court. This created a new sense of collective responsibility. It implied that an injustice against any single Athenian was an injury to the community as a whole. It was a legal embodiment of the idea of a commonwealth, a state where all citizens were bound together by a shared interest in justice. The scales of justice were slowly, painstakingly, beginning to find their balance. The creation of these popular courts was chipping away at the power of the Areopagus and empowering the demos in one of the most fundamental areas of civic life. To understand the heart of an ancient Athenian, we must understand their myths. For us, mythology is a collection of fascinating stories. For them, it was something far deeper. It was their history, their science, their moral compass, and the charter of their political identity. The shared stories of gods and heroes were the cultural DNA of the city, a powerful, unifying force that bound them together and explained their place in the world. In the era before democracy, these myths were often used by the aristocracy to legitimize their rule. But they also contained the seeds of a broader, more inclusive civic identity that would later blossom in the democratic city. The Athenians saw themselves as a special people, unique among the Greeks. A central element of this belief was the myth of their autochthony. They believed that they had not migrated to Attica from somewhere else, but that they had sprung directly from the soil itself. The first Athenian king, Eryxthonius, was said to have been born of the earth, a child of Hephaestus and Gaia. This myth gave the Athenians a profound and mystical connection to their land. It meant that every citizen, rich or poor, shared in this unique, earth-born heritage. It created a powerful sense of belonging and a fierce protective love for the Attic soil. The city's divine patron was, of course, the goddess Athena. The story of her contest with the sea god, Poseidon, for control of the city, was a foundational myth, retold from generation to generation. Poseidon struck the Acropolis with his trident, bringing forth a spring of salt water. Athena, in a wiser, more nurturing gesture, planted the first olive tree. The gods judged her gift to be the more useful, and the city was named for her. This story was a constant reminder of the city's values. It celebrated wisdom, craft, and the life-giving produce of the land over the untamed, often violent power of the sea. Athena was not just a warrior goddess, she was a patron of potters, weavers, and all those who created things with skill and intelligence. But the most important hero of the Athenian mythological landscape was Theseus. He was their great state builder, a figure whose legends were consciously shaped and promoted to serve as a model for the city's political aspirations. The most famous of his myths is his journey to Crete to slay the Minotaur, a monstrous creature who devoured young Athenians sent as tribute to the Cretan king, Minos. This story of liberation from a foreign tyrant was a powerful allegory for Athens' own desire for freedom and self-determination. Theseus, the brave young prince who volunteered to face the monster and save his people, became the embodiment of civic courage. Even more significant was the myth of Theseus's Synoecism. This was the belief that Theseus had unified the scattered towns and villages of Attica into a single, centralized state with Athens as its capital. He was said to have brought the local nobles to the city, created common political institutions, and established a festival, the Panathenaea, to celebrate this new unity. In this myth, Theseus is portrayed as a wise and benevolent king who laid the foundations of the Athenian state. Later, in the democratic era, he would even be reimagined as a kind of proto-democrat, a king who willingly gave power to the people. While the historical reality of this unification was a much slower, more complex process, the myth provided a powerful charter for Athenian unity and civic identity. It told the Athenians that they were not just a collection of separate villages, but one people, united by a heroic founder. These shared stories, repeated at festivals, depicted on pottery, and sung by poets, created a common cultural language that transcended the divisions of class and wealth, and helped to create the sense of a single Athenian people on which the idea of democracy could ultimately be built. In the shadow of the Acropolis, in a low-lying, dusty expanse of ground, lay the space that would one day become the bustling heart of democratic Athens, the Agora. But in these early, pre-democratic centuries, the Agora was a very different place. It was not yet the grand civic center filled with public buildings and statues that we imagine today. It was a more modest, multi-purpose space, an open field that was slowly, tentatively, beginning to find its identity as the city's common ground. The evolution of the Agora, from a simple marketplace to the central stage for commerce, politics, and justice, is a quiet story of the privatization of sacred spaces on the Acropolis and the publicization of common spaces below. In its earliest form, the Agora was primarily a place of commerce. Farmers from the Attic countryside would bring their produce here, their olives, their figs, their grain to sell or barter. Potters from the Kerameikos would set up stalls to display their latest wares. Fishermen would arrive from the port of Phaleron with the day's catch. It was a noisy, chaotic, and vibrant place, a meeting point for people from all walks of life. Here, a wealthy aristocrat's steward might haggle over the price of wine with a humble merchant, and a small farmer might trade a basket of eggs for a new clay pot. It was one of the few places in the city where the different social classes regularly mixed and interacted. But it was more than just a market. Because it was a place where people naturally gathered, it also became a center for social life and the exchange of information. It was here that you would hear the latest news from the harbor, the latest gossip from the great houses, the latest rumors of political maneuvering. Men would gather in the shade of a plane tree to talk, to argue, to make deals. It was a space for informal assembly, a place where public opinion, however weak and unformed, could begin to take shape. The conversations that took place in the dust of the agora were the first faint whispers of a public sphere. Slowly, the space also began to acquire a civic and political character. While the most important religious and political rituals still took place on the exclusive heights of the Acropolis, the agora began to be used for more public, day-to-day administrative functions. A simple wooden post might be set up, on which new laws or decrees were displayed for those who could read. Magistrates might set up a temporary platform to hear minor legal disputes or make public announcements. The assembly, the ecclesia, may have even met here on occasion before it settled on the Pnyx Hill. The agora was becoming the city's bulletin board and its outdoor administrative office. The physical landscape of the space reflected its evolving role. The first public buildings began to appear around its edges, simple structures at first. There might have been a fountain house, providing a clean source of water and serving as a social gathering spot. Boundary stones or horo were set up to formally define the sacred public space of the agora, separating it from the private property that surrounded it. To step past the horo was to enter the common ground of the city. This simple act of physically marking out a public space was a profoundly important step. It was a tangible declaration that there was a part of the city that belonged not to a particular family or a particular god, but to all citizens in common. The agora was becoming the secular counterpart to the sacred Acropolis, the heart of the city's human earthly affairs. It was a blank canvas on which the Athenians would soon paint the masterpiece of their democracy. The way a city builds reveals its soul, the stones of its temples, the layout of its public squares, the very walls that enclose it. They are a silent testament to the city's values, its fears, and its distribution of power. In the long twilight before democracy, the architecture of Athens underwent a slow but telling transformation. The shift from buildings that celebrated the power of gods and aristocratic families to structures that served the needs of an emerging public was a physical manifestation of the deep political and social changes that were reshaping the city. The story of this evolving Athens is written in its limestone, its timber, and its terracotta roof tiles. In the earliest period, the most impressive structures were not public buildings, but the tombs of aristocratic clans, located just outside the city gates. These were monuments to the power and permanence of the great families. A wealthy clan would build a large burial mound, or tumulus, to house their dead, a powerful statement of their lineage and their claim to the land. The other dominant architectural form was of course the temple. The early temples on the Acropolis were built to house the gods and to serve as centers for the state cult, a cult that was, as we've seen, controlled by the aristocracy. These buildings were designed to inspire awe and reverence, to emphasize the gap between the divine realm and its priestly servants and the ordinary mortal. But as the polis, the city-state, began to mature as a concept, a new kind of architecture started to emerge: public, civic architecture. This was a radical innovation. The idea of constructing a large, expensive building that was intended for the use of all citizens, rather than a god or a single family, was a sign of a new way of thinking about the community. One of the earliest and most important examples of this was the fountain house. In a hot, dry climate, a reliable source of clean public water was a huge benefit to the entire population. The construction of an ornate fountain house in the agora was a project that served everyone, rich and poor. It was a physical investment in the common good. The rise of the tyrant Pisistratus in the 6th century BC marked a major acceleration in this public building program. Although he seized power unconstitutionally, Pisistratus ruled as a populist, seeking to win the favor of the common people and weaken the power of the rival aristocratic clans. He embarked on an ambitious series of public works that transformed the face of Athens. He began construction of a massive temple to Olympian Zeus, a project designed to rival the greatest temples in the Greek world and bring glory to the city as a whole. He also undertook projects that were more practical. He improved the city's water supply with aqueducts and fountain houses, and likely initiated the first major public buildings in the agora. These projects had a dual effect. On one hand, they beautified the city and improved the quality of life for its residents. They provided jobs for stonecutters, masons, and laborers, stimulating the urban economy. On the other hand, they were a powerful form of political propaganda. These grand public buildings were a constant visible reminder of the tyrant's beneficence and power. They were monuments to the state and to the man who was leading it, rather than to the old aristocratic families. Pisistratus was in effect using public architecture to create a new focus for civic loyalty, shifting it away from the old clans and towards the city itself. This act of building for the demos was a crucial step. It accustomed the Athenians to the idea of a public realm, a shared civic space that belonged to them all. The stones that Pisistratus laid down were, in a very real sense, part of the foundation for the democracy that his son's successors would be unable to prevent. In all of our wanderings through the public spaces of this early city, the agora, the assembly, the battlefield, one half of the population has remained almost entirely in the shadows. To tell the story of pre-democratic Athens without speaking of its women is to tell only half the tale. Their world was largely separate, their voices muted in the historical record, but their roles were absolutely essential to the functioning and the very survival of the city. Confined primarily to the private sphere of the household, women were the silent, steady anchors of the oikos, the guardians of the family, and the vital link in the chain of lineage and inheritance that was so central to this aristocratic society. The life of an Athenian woman, particularly one from a noble family, was lived almost entirely within the walls of her home. The oikos was divided into the andron, the public, male quarters at the front of the house, and the gynoeceum, the private, female quarters at the back. This physical separation mirrored the social division of the sexes. The man's world was the public life of the city. The woman's world was the private life of the household. A respectable woman was not supposed to be seen or spoken of in public. Her virtue was measured by her modesty, her industry, and her invisibility. Her primary role was to be a wife and a mother. Marriages were not romantic arrangements. They were business transactions between families, negotiated by the woman's father or male guardian. A girl would typically be married very young, often around the age of 14, to a man who might be twice her age. Her duty was to produce a male heir, to continue her husband's family line and inherit his property. In a society obsessed with lineage and citizenship, the legitimacy of a child was paramount. A wife's fidelity was therefore a matter of grave public concern, and her life was carefully guarded to ensure there could be no doubt about the parentage of her children. Within the home, however, the wife of the head of the household, the kyria, wielded considerable authority. She was the manager of the oikos. She directed the work of the household slaves, managed the family's supplies of food and clothing, and oversaw the raising of young children. One of her most important tasks was weaving. The production of textiles was a vital part of the household economy, and a source of great pride. To be a skilled weaver was a sign of a woman's competence and virtue. It was a quiet, creative power, a way of contributing tangible value to the family's wealth and well-being. While excluded from politics, women were central to the religious life of the city. Certain cults and festivals were exclusively female domains. The Thesmophoria, a festival in honor of the grain goddess Demeter, was one of the most important religious events of the year, and only married citizen women were allowed to participate. In these secret rites, they prayed for the fertility of the land and the fertility of their own bodies, performing a crucial civic function that the men could not. Women also served as priestesses for many of the city's cults, particularly those dedicated to goddesses. The high priestess of Athena Polias, the city's protector, was one of the most important religious figures in Athens, a position of great honor and influence. Religion was the one sphere where women could hold public office and play a visible, respected role in the life of the community. Their lives were circumscribed by powerful social constraints, but to see them as simply powerless or passive is to miss the essential, foundational role they played in holding the world of the city together. Far to the south, in a fertile river valley enclosed by rugged mountains, a different kind of Greek city-state was taking shape, a city that would become the eternal counterpoint to Athens. This was Sparta, a society as rigid, disciplined, and land-bound as Athens was becoming fluid, creative, and seafaring. In these early centuries, the great rivalry that would define the classical age was still in its infancy, but the two cities were already set on dramatically different paths. The relationship between the Athenian owl of wisdom and the Spartan wolf of war was from the beginning a dance of contrasts, a mixture of wary respect, deep suspicion, and profound mutual misunderstanding that shaped them both. Sparta's unique social structure was born out of a historical trauma. They had conquered the neighboring region of Messenia and reduced its population to a state of serfdom. These serfs, known as helots, vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters. The constant, terrifying fear of a helot uprising became the organizing principle of Spartan society. Everything, their education, their government, their family life, was subordinated to a single goal: maintaining a state of permanent military readiness to control the helot population. This created a society unlike any other in Greece. While Athenian aristocrats competed for personal glory and wealth, Spartan citizens were expected to live a life of austere, egalitarian simplicity. All male citizens were professional soldiers, forbidden from engaging in agriculture or commerce, which were left to the helots, and a class of non-citizen craftsmen. From the age of 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his family to live in a military barracks, where he endured a brutal and relentless training regimen designed to strip him of his individuality and forge him into a perfect, unquestioning cog in the Spartan war machine. The phalanx was not just a military tactic for Sparta, it was the essence of their state. The Spartan system of government was a strange conservative mix of monarchy, oligarchy, and democratic elements. They had 2 kings, a council of elders called the Gerousia, and an assembly of all citizens. But the real power lay with the Gerousia and a small board of officials called the ephors. It was a deeply conservative system, designed to prevent change and preserve the existing order at all costs. They were suspicious of foreigners, hostile to new ideas, and contemptuous of the luxury and commerce that were beginning to define cities like Athens. To the Athenians, Sparta must have seemed like a bizarre, alien world. They would have respected the legendary discipline and courage of the Spartan army, but they would have been horrified by the lack of personal freedom, the suppression of the individual, and the absence of the vibrant artistic and intellectual life that was beginning to flourish in their own city. The Spartans, in turn, looked at Athens with disdain. They saw the Athenians as talkative, unreliable, and dangerously innovative. They distrusted their merchant ships, their powerful navy, and their growing empire. This early dance was mostly one of distance and avoidance. They inhabited different spheres of influence. Sparta was the undisputed master of the Peloponnese, the great land power of Greece, and it used its army to create and dominate a league of allied states. Athens, meanwhile, was beginning to look outward, to the sea, to the islands of the Aegean, and to the wider world of trade and colonization. They were like 2 great predators circling each other, each the master of its own domain. For now their paths rarely crossed directly, but the contrast they presented was a powerful one. The existence of the Spartan alternative, a model of stability, order, and military might achieved through the total subordination of the individual, was a constant, looming presence in the Greek world, a dark mirror that made Athens' own developing experiment with freedom and individuality shine all the more brightly. Art is a language of the soul, a way for a culture to speak its deepest truths and its quietest aspirations. The art of pre-democratic Athens, particularly its pottery and its sculpture, is more than just beautiful. It's a document of a society in transition, As we look at the figures painted on a vase, or the serene smile of an archaic statue, we can see the slow, subtle shift in focus from the divine and the mythical to the human and the civic. The artists of this era, perhaps without even knowing it, were beginning to shape a new visual language, one that celebrated the potential of the individual and the value of the human community, ideals that would become the very cornerstones of democracy. In the earlier archaic period, Greek art was heavily influenced by the monumental cultures of Egypt and the Near East. The sculptures of this time, the kouroi, statues of nude young men, and kouroi, statues of draped young women, are stiff, formal, and symmetrical. They stand rigidly, with one foot forward, their faces fixed in a distant, enigmatic expression known as the archaic smiles. These statues were often commissioned by wealthy aristocratic families as grave markers or as offerings in a sanctuary. They represent an ideal of youthful, noble perfection, an image of the aristocratic orator. They are beautiful, but they are not yet individuals. They are types, symbols of a class and its values. But as the 6th century progresses, we begin to see a change. The sculptors become more skilled, more interested in naturalism. The kouroi begin to look less like Egyptian statues and more like actual human beings. Their bodies become more anatomically correct, their muscles more defined, their poses more relaxed. The archaic smile becomes softer, more natural. The artists are beginning to look more closely at the world around them, to celebrate the beauty and the reality of the human form. This growing humanism in art, this focus on the real observable world, is the visual counterpart to the intellectual revolution of the pre-Socratic philosophers. The most exciting developments, however, were happening in the potter's quarter. The art of vase painting was undergoing a rapid and brilliant evolution. The dominant style of the early archaic period was black figure, where figures were painted in black silhouette against the natural red clay of the vase, with details incised with a sharp tool. Athenian artists became the undisputed masters of this technique. They covered their vases with an incredible variety of scenes, myths of gods and heroes, epic battles from the Trojan War, athletic contests, and scenes from daily life. These vases were more than just containers for wine and oil. They were a medium for storytelling, a way of spreading the shared cultural narratives of the city. A vase depicting Theseus slaying the Minotaur was a piece of civic propaganda, a celebration of Athenian heroism that could be exported and admired throughout the Greek world. But even more interesting are the scenes of ordinary life: a potter at his wheel, a group of hoplites arming for battle, a symposium in full swing. These paintings show a new interest in the activities of the human community. They celebrate the skills of the craftsman and the courage of the citizen soldier. They are a reflection of a society that is beginning to see itself, and not just its gods and mythical ancestors, as a worthy subject for art. Then, around 530 BC, a revolutionary new technique was invented in Athens: red figure painting. Instead of painting the figures in black, the artists now painted the background in black, leaving the figures in the natural red of the clay. Details could then be painted on with a fine brush, allowing for a much greater degree of naturalism, fluidity, and emotional expression. This technical innovation unleashed a torrent of artistic creativity. The figures on red figure vases are more dynamic, more three-dimensional, more psychologically complex. They are not just symbols, they are characters. This artistic breakthrough, which celebrated the potential for detail, nuance, and individual expression, was the perfect artistic metaphor for the political breakthrough that was about to occur. The artist's brush, just like the reformer's law, was beginning to focus on the individual. As our journey through this older Athens nears its end, let's pause to consider the economic ground beneath the city's feet. Politics and philosophy do not happen in a vacuum. They are shaped by the hard realities of how people make a living, how they trade, and how wealth is created and distributed. The Athens that stood on the brink of democracy was a city whose economy had grown in complexity and dynamism to the point where the old political structures were no longer adequate to contain it. The economic foundations laid in the archaic period, often unintentionally, created the very pressures and possibilities that made democratic reform not just an abstract idea, but a practical necessity. The key to this transformation was the shift away from a purely agricultural, land-based economy towards a more diversified, commercial one. As we've seen, the power of the old Eupatridae was rooted in their ownership of vast ancestral estates. In this older world, wealth was static. You were wealthy if your father was wealthy and had land to pass on to you. But the rise of trade and crafts introduced a new, more dynamic form of wealth. A merchant's fortune was not in the soil. It was in his ships, his goods, and his silver. A craftsman's wealth was in his skill and his workshop. This commercial wealth was fluid, and it created new men of property who did not fit neatly into the old aristocratic hierarchy. The introduction of coinage in the 6th century BC dramatically accelerated this process. Before coins, trade was a cumbersome process of barter, or involved weighing out scraps of precious metal. The striking of standardized state-guaranteed silver coins, made from the mines at Lorient, made commerce faster, easier, and more abstract. A coin is an anonymous, transportable form of wealth. It allowed for the accumulation of capital in a way that had never been possible before. It fueled the growth of a market economy in the agora and created a new class of people, bankers, lenders, and merchants, whose power was based on money, not land. This monetization of the economy was a powerful solvent of the old traditional social bonds based on personal loyalty and obligation. At the same time, the agricultural sector itself was in a state of crisis. The plight of the small farmers, the hectamori or sixth parters who had to give a large portion of their produce to their creditors, was the most pressing social problem of the age. The reforms of Solon, particularly his cancellation of debts, were a direct response to this economic crisis. But Solon did more than just address the immediate problem. He also passed laws designed to stimulate the commercial economy. He is said to have encouraged the cultivation of olives and grapes for export, as these were more profitable cash crops than grain. He also reportedly offered Athenian citizenship to skilled craftsmen from other cities who were willing to immigrate and set up their workshops in Athens. These policies, whether they were Solon's or part of a broader trend, had a profound long-term effect. They consciously reoriented the Athenian economy towards trade and manufacturing. This created a larger and more confident class of craftsmen, traders, and sailors. Many of these men were from the lower rungs of the citizen body, the thous. As Athens' commercial and naval power grew, the importance of these men to the city's prosperity and security grew with it. They built the ships, they rowed the ships, and they produced the goods that the ships carried. An economy that was increasingly dependent on the skills and labor of its common citizens was an economy that was primed for a political system that gave those citizens a voice. The economic changes had created a new social reality, and the political system was straining to catch up. And so, as the first light of a new era begins to touch the horizon, let us spend our last few moments in the forgotten hours of this older Athens, in the quiet, ordinary rhythms of a day lived long ago. History so often focuses on the great men and the grand events, but the true texture of a society is found in the simple, repeated acts of daily life. The baking of bread, the fetching of water, the telling of stories as darkness falls. It was in these countless, unrecorded moments that the character of the Athenian people was forged, a character of resilience, pragmatism, and a deep-seated love for their city that would soon find its ultimate expression in the world's first democracy. For a small farmer in the Attic countryside, the day began before sunrise, with the crowing of the rooster. His life was governed by the sun and the seasons. His home was a simple structure of sun-dried mud brick, with a packed earth floor. His world was small, centered on his family, his fields, and his nearby village. His joys were simple: a good harvest, the birth of a healthy child, a village festival with its songs and dances. His fears were constant: a drought that could wither his crops, a blight that could sicken his olive trees, the ever-present threat of falling into debt to the great lord, whose estate bordered his own. He was a man of the earth, his hands calloused from the plough, his face weathered by the sun. He was the sturdy, silent foundation on which the entire city rested. In the city itself, The day began with the opening of the market in the agora. The air would fill with the sounds and smells of commerce, the bleating of goats, the sharp scent of fish from the sea, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer from a nearby workshop. A potter, his hands covered in wet clay, would work at his wheel, his movements practiced and sure, shaping an amphora that might one day hold wine on a ship bound for Italy. His life was one of skill and routine, his status determined by the quality of his work and the success of his workshop. He was a part of the city's growing, bustling heart, a man whose fortunes were tied not to the land, but to the flow of trade and the demands of the market. For the women in the gyneceum of an aristocratic house, the day was a quiet routine of domestic management. They would oversee the grinding of grain, the baking of bread in the courtyard oven, and the endless rhythmic work of the loom. Their world was enclosed, but it was not empty. It was a world of female community, of shared work and shared lives. They would tell stories, sing songs, and raise their children, passing on the traditions and the values of their family and their city. They were the keepers of the flame, the guardians of the household and the essential, unseen heart of the oikos. As evening fell, the city would grow quiet. The farmers would return from their fields, the craftsmen would clean their tools, and families would gather for their simple evening meal of bread, olives, and perhaps a little cheese or fish. The light would come from a flickering, smoky olive oil lamp. In the grand houses of the aristocrats, the men might gather for a symposium, but in the humble homes of the common people, the evening would be a time for rest, for mending tools, for telling the children the ancient stories of Theseus and Athena. It was in these quiet hours, in these simple homes, that the ideas we have been exploring, of community, of fairness, of a shared destiny, were nurtured. The people of this forgotten Athens were not yet democrats, but they were citizens in waiting. They were a people who had learned, through long centuries of struggle and adaptation, to be resilient, to be resourceful, and to believe in the value of their community. The stage was now set. The sun was rising on a new kind of city, a city that would dare to believe that ordinary people could, together, achieve extraordinary things.